Okay, Jeannie and Diane asked if I would give this presentation. It's a modification of one that I gave to the Academy of Pediatrics recently, with a few extra slides added to focus directly on FiCare. So the key points are these. We, because we have these babies under our care, are responsible to create the optimal environment for the development of their brains. They're here with us. Their brains are at a very active stage of growth. This is our responsibility. And we can't do it by ourselves. There are, both because of our time constraints and because of who we are, not the parents themselves, we can't do everything needed to optimize the environment for babies' brain growth. So we need parents to provide that. And the bottom line is the babies who don't get this optimal environment from us or their parents don't do as well in the long run. We just talked about this with the issue of private rooms and parents who may not be here. That data is very clear, whether it's from a unit like St. Louis, where they compared babies in private rooms to babies in an open setup, or the study that was done at Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island when they went from an open bay to all private rooms. In both cases, they showed that the presence of parents was the active ingredient in getting better outcomes for their babies. And to some extent, we and volunteers can replace that, but not entirely. So this has real long-term implications. It's not just about a nice thing to do. It's about this is what our obligation is for these babies to give them the best possible long-term outcomes. So the first piece of this is to make the point quickly that parent-centered care is natural and normal. It is not natural and normal in the ICU, but that's because we started all wrong with this, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But just to remind you that in nature, this is what's normal. And we know from this huge animal literature that is now 60 or 70 years old that in every mammalian species studied, if you separate the baby from their mother at birth for some period of time after birth, it leads to long-lasting physical and mental problems for both the baby and the mother. So the evidence is absolutely clear. The babies and mothers belong together. We, however, didn't do it that way, and we are now coming to realize, and we realized it first in the main nursery. These studies were done in the 1970s and showed that the separation of babies from their mothers was not only bad for the babies, but interfered with maternal bonding on a long-term basis. Some of these studies now have 20-year follow-up to show that this is still true 20 years later. So we got it wrong in the main nursery, and there's a hubris about all of this that we have to acknowledge. We know that babies and mothers did fine even before hospitals were constructed. We know that when we started doing NICU, which started at a World's Fair exhibition, and parents were excluded, that there were still babies who survived at home. Doctors would say, there's nothing we can do for your 2-pound baby, just take them home and love them, and they will probably die in a few days. But we have all heard these stories, true stories, not unusual, that moms would take those babies home, put them in a shoebox by the stove, feed them with an eyedropper, and here they were 20 or 30 years later doing fine. So there was always an alternative that was out there, but because of our hubris as a medical community, we thought we could do it better. So we set up an environment of care that did not include families. And even in recent years, the picture on the right is typical. I showed this at AAP, and this is Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island before they moved to their new unit. But the guy who invited me is now the chairman of the perinatal section. We trained together at Hopkins, and he was convinced this was the Hopkins nursery because that's what the Hopkins nursery looked like too. So everybody could identify with that environment. Ours, on the left, in our old unit, was very different from the typical environment that people put their babies in. But even that, you'll notice, there's no families in that picture. So the next piece, it's natural and normal for babies and their parents to be together. The next piece is, this isn't just a nice thing and the natural thing. This is the better thing. And I've talked a little bit about the data already. Here's some more data. This is from Karolinska that did a randomized controlled trial and showed that babies who were in their private rooms did better, both in terms of length of stay and in their incidence of disability, specifically bronchopulmonary dysplasia, when they were in the rooms with their parents. We had this same length of stay experience. Our length of stay decreased by 2 days from our old unit to our new unit. And we're all the same people, and our practices were all the same. The significant difference was we gave families much more opportunity to be with their babies. So we know this is true. This is from Women and Infants Hospital in Rhode Island. This is the study that showed that the environment itself didn't lead to this improved outcome. NTISS procedural is a neurological test, developmental test. If you just compared single rooms to the open bay, there was no benefit in the population as a whole, but in the population where the parents were present in the rooms with the babies, that led to a significant improvement in multiple outcomes. And they looked at medical, developmental, they looked at parents, they looked at staff attitudes, and those were better in every domain that they measured. So it's natural, it's normal, it's beneficial, and it makes sense. So we know you all have seen these photos or slides about how babies' brains are growing so dramatically in the third trimester, which is when we have them. And where that's happening for adults, it's in information processing. We're constantly building new synapses as we learn. But infants, it's all in the sensory. So they are learning some stuff like language, but even that goes by way of the auditory cortex. So these parts of the cortex are where this huge development of synapses is happening, and it happens for better or for worse. It's happening in a deprived situation or it's happening in an enriched situation. And which one of those it is up to us and then up to the families to the extent that we let them. And this is just to emphasize again, there's a biological component here that we can't do anything about. This is just how it is. We are altricial mammals. So precocial mammals are those that shortly after they're born can ambulate, go find their mother for food, run away from danger. So goats and cows and horses are examples of that. But we are not that way. We depend, the newborn baby is virtually entirely dependent on its mother for all of these things. And when we separate them, we are doing something that's profoundly unnatural. If you look at individual stimuli, in every case, they are better for a baby in the mother's arms instead of in an incubator. And we've come a long ways. If you look on the right, the typical U.S. center is where we were 10 years ago. Then we participated in a Vaughan collaborative with several other really good hospitals in the country and got from 1% to 3% of our time. If you do like we did for the Kangaroo-a-thon, where you add up all the time the babies are skin to skin, and your denominator is 168 hours a week times our average census, we went from 1% to 3%. And so we were 3 times better than the average U.S. center and better than we were at that point. Since we've moved to the new unit, it's up to 10%. So this unit has made a difference, and the culture that we have has made a difference. But we still have a long way to go. The reasons this has taken a long time are many. We started out wrong, and we held on to the status quo, and we tended to make up excuses to justify the status quo, even though there was no evidence base. So, for example, if you're going to be scientific about it, you're going to say, well, you have to do studies to prove that this is better, even though there were no studies to show that separating babies from their mothers was better in the first place. We do resist change. That's just human nature. And we had this idea that when babies were asleep, they were these inanimate objects. But in fact, babies, alone among any other time in life, you can't learn when you're asleep at any other stage of your life, but babies do. This is well documented. So when we think this baby's asleep, so let's not disturb it, let's not let the rocker hold them or read to them, that's misguided, because they do need their sleep, and you don't get them out and wake them up, but you all know that you can usually get a baby out and they'll continue to sleep. And if the rocker is singing to them or talking to them, that's beneficial. That's stimulating brain growth. And we're depriving them of that by saying, no, don't bother my baby because they're asleep. So we're just returning to a more natural environment of care. We're not doing something radical. We are just getting back to where we should have been in the first place. And the evidence base is really strong. And it's just not me and a few other people preaching this. This has been said for many years. We've just been very resistant to change. So I've used this slide for probably 15 years now, and it still feels like it's not worn out, because we still aren't quite there. So we still think of the incubator as a warm, secure place to keep babies, and getting them out, particularly if they're still on a ventilator or they have catheters or something, is a hassle and risky. But I think in the future we will understand that the mother's arms is the natural extension of the fetal environment, that is a rich source of natural stimuli, and that to leave the baby in the incubator and take that away from them is depriving them. And sometimes we have to use that. We don't have any choice. Sometimes it is stressful and risky to take a baby out, but not nearly as often as we have thought in the past. So just to focus on this idea that we need to do a lot more for our babies' brains than what we've been doing in the past. And again, parents are a big part of helping us do what is needed. So these are the working premises that we built this unit on. First, the babies and families should not be separated because of either structural, we don't have the space to keep them together, or operational, we don't have the culture to keep them together. When their families cannot or will not spend much time with them, we still have to provide them this human contact. And I'll point again to our volunteer program that I don't think we have used optimally for many, many years, because we have not allowed volunteers to interact with babies if they were asleep, or for various other reasons that seem to me to have more to do with the convenience to the staff than for the good of the babies. Or I think it was for the good of the babies, in many cases, is just a misunderstood good of the babies. And what's really good for the babies is to both sleep and get human contact there, not to just sleep without that human contact. So how I've tried to look at things for many years now is try to figure out where we're going to be in the future, and then try to get there now, rather than looking back and wishing, boy, I wish we had done this sooner, because now we realize how important it is. And still, it takes a long time. It took 17 years to get our new unit built, and our culture, and I'll say this over and over again, we have a really good culture. We are really good. This is not about we've been bad and we've got to get better. This is about, we're really good, but we've got room to improve still, and it's important to our babies and our families that we do. So I know we can't get there tomorrow, but let's get there as quickly as we can, because every baby who's here doesn't have until next year to get that benefit. They're losing out on it if we're not doing it today. I put this in about the oxygen delivery for high-risk babies because it will be a topic maybe even today, but certainly in the weeks and months to come. This was a slide that I used at Graven's a few years ago, and it's still very topical now. But consider these questions. Are high oxygen saturations dangerous to babies? We all know that they are. We know that low oxygen saturations are dangerous. And I think we would all say that we are not always able to respond to high or low alarms in a timely manner because you are busy with another baby and you can't drop in the middle of a feeding and go adjust an oxygen concentration, even though that's what would be best for that baby. So I think we all believe that some parents are capable of being trained to do that, and that provides a benefit both for the baby and the nurse, who doesn't have to drop what they're doing, and I think for the parent as well. So, yeah.
Do you think our volunteers can also be trained? Because if they're the ones that are taking care of the babies because moms can't, could they also do that?
I think that's a question for down the road. In theory, yes. That's not a bridge I want to cross till we get parents. And even, it isn't even all parents. It's only a limited number of parents that are here enough and willing to get the appropriate training and are trustworthy enough. But we have certainly had parents who are medical professionals who we haven't let do this, who we know would be capable. And so I think for this to be successful, we should start with people that will do it well and then roll it out gradually to others. But yes, I think it would be to the benefit of the babies in the long run if anybody who was with that baby and was properly trained could adjust their oxygen without waiting for somebody else to come if they're busy doing something else important. So I want us to have this concept of what we're feeding babies' brains. It's not just about oxygen and calories. It's also about sensory stimulus, which is just as important to those brains as oxygen and calories are. So FiCare is not about turning our jobs over to parents. We can teach them to do some of our caregiving tasks like changing diapers and moving the sat probe and so on. But even that is largely just a way of helping them feel more comfortable interacting with their baby. Or in the case of oxygen concentrations, actually improving their baby's care. But FiCare is really much more about encouraging them to be parents. So it's not just about giving our job to them, it's about giving their job to them, which we have stood in the way of for so long. We want them to be parents. We want them to be the ones who are nurturing their babies. We want them to be the ones who are giving their babies all of this sensory input that is important in this stage of their development. And they shouldn't have to wait till their baby gets out into a crib and we decide now it's okay for them to do this. And again, I'll state some things in a little bit of a black and white manner, and I don't really think that way. I know that we've done a lot of this. But understand that some of these slides get used in places where people are far less along this path than we are. So we need them to provide this nurturing environment that we can't. We just, if you have a 1 to 3 assignment, you can't do that for all your babies. You don't have the time. You have maybe this much more time than what you've got now that you could engage in that, but you don't have this much more, and that's what would be ideal for the babies. So babies need abundant sensory input. Mostly that's just good old TLC. It's not anything fancy. Anyone can give them that, but they do need a lot. It's not just an hour a day. That's better than nothing, but it's a lot less than the optimal. So we either allow parents to do that, which is what FiCare is about, and then use volunteers and us as the default if parents aren't, or we have some responsibility for the fact that they aren't getting that. So getting there means understanding why, and that's a piece of what this was about. That I think it's really important for people to know how valuable this is for babies, and because it isn't something that gets taught very well in training. It isn't something that gets taught very well in practice in most places. So we have to get that understanding and transmit it throughout our unit. The how is things that we all have people working on, and then measuring how we get there. And the example I used was for metrics with Bosch and QI, that Bosch follows those metrics fastidiously, and every time there's an opportunity for improvement, we have the numbers to look at, and Bosch drives us to get better. And we have gotten better steadily, and babies have benefited as a result. So that's a nice model that you're all familiar with for how metrics and a commitment to excellence can get us from good to great. And we are really good, but our job isn't done. I did want to add one more thing to this. Since I had the floor, I've sent an email to a few people about this, but I just wanted to suggest that we think about the words that we use. Visitor still shows up. They just sent a brochure out that was being developed to give to parents a month ago, and it had visitor in there in describing parents. And I don't know that there is never a time when we should use that word, but it really shouldn't be part of our vocabulary. Parents are part of the care team. And when you talk about, instead of saying parents visited, say what they did when they were here. And if they did nothing, say that. That's useful information. In some cases, it's going to end up going to DCS, for example. But there are other ways to be more descriptive of what's going on that are useful. We talk about parents refusing something, and that sets that up immediately as a conflict and as a judgment that they said no to something that we think they should have said yes to. But they can decline a circumcision or any of these other things. There are a few things that we feel very strongly that a baby needs, and maybe it's appropriate to use refuse in that circumstance, but most of the time parents are just declining an option that they have, and there's no judgment about if they do so. Attempting breastfeedings, I don't know, maybe this one is just me, but it feels like that's judgmental too, that it kind of implies failure from the start. Mothers don't attempt breastfeeding, they breastfeed. And maybe babies don't do very well. It's on the baby, not the mother. So you can describe that again just as what happened. Maybe the baby fed poorly, that's fine. But the mom did breastfeed for those 5 minutes. She didn't attempt to breastfeed. So I'm not going to be monitoring how people use these words. I just want us to think about, because these are all carryovers from the old, we're in charge and you're going to do whatever we tell you to a more partnership that we want to have with families.
That makes me remind me, because you're the one that told me, when the hearing screen, when we say failed,
Yeah.
it's like, you taught me that, it's like, no, they didn't pass.
They referred.
The failed sounds awful when you hear that.
Yeah, so that's another thing we say to parents, that kids who refer, way more often than not, turn out their hearing is fine. And they didn't fail. It's just a screening test that picks up a lot of false positives. Thank you. Okay, I hoped we would have some time for conversation about how we get from here to where we want to be, and maybe identifying where some of the barriers are that we could address.
I have one thing, and I don't really know the process of this, and I know it doesn't replace.
Hang on, let me give you the microphone because we want to make sure the questions get recorded.
I don't really know the process, and I know it doesn't replace the parents, but I know some babies have the recordings in the room of mom and dad reading a book, sometimes and some don't. It's like Kaylee's been here a long time, she doesn't. I don't know how that gets approached, or
Cambrai.
so is that something the nurse needs to go to Cambrai, or does she just contact each parent, or why?
Well, ask
And how
Cambrai
beneficial
she
is
wants
that?
to work it. I don't know if she wants to have ownership of that, or if she wants to have multiple people doing that. But I think she is interested in doing it, so please just ask her.
Because
how
is
she
that
wants to do it.
beneficial at night to be playing that on and off? Right. I know it doesn't replace mom holding,
So,
but
there are some studies showing particularly music and its benefit, but the thing to remember here is that it's not truly a replacement. And the same thing is true for the scent cloths that sometimes we did and then it falls out and then gets started again. When babies have that skin-to-skin experience with their mother, they have all of those senses stimulated together. And that's true in utero too. So they taste the amniotic fluid, they feel the mother's movement, they hear the mother's voice and heartbeat. They're getting all of those stimuli together. And that same thing happens when mom or you or anybody else is holding the baby. They get a multisensory experience and they can integrate all of this. That's how our brains are meant to work. So if you give them only one piece of that, it's better than nothing, but it's not really a replacement for
right.
human contact.
Okay, I have one more question. I don't know if it's infection control as cost, but we've seen hospitals that have the front packs. I mean, there's times when, like, with Kaylee, we hold all the time, but you're trying to chart, so you're holding
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
the front packs that you can hold them, so they would have at least that contact and be held. Or is that something that we looked at, or?
You guys okay with papoosing babies?
So you start with TV current first day, second day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Because
I-
it's,
I think we would want to have parental consent for that
Right.
too, but I like that idea.
How would we accomplish monitoring?
well, even in the
Would you
room,
have
like
to
if
just
I'm,
stay in the room to do it? To chart?
yeah, or if I'm charting and I'm trying to hold her in one arm and chart and keep it clean, but if when she was off oxygen, I unhooked her for a little bit because I'm holding her in one arm and watching her, and I'm sitting at the desk charting, so there's times I've unhooked her if she's stable. And
Yeah, it'd be the feeder growers, yeah.
Yeah.
The ones
Yeah.
that we take out to chart with anyway.
Right, right.
Where did we see those probes have just one probe and it was gonna pick up signals remotely? Was there a rep that can hear?
I don't know, but they will be wireless soon, so I think that'll be easy to do.
We will be wireless here soon.
No, the technology, the wireless saturation probes that also pick up heart rate, they're out there. They're not cheap, and so they're not something we're going to buy tomorrow, but the technology is already there that sooner or later it will be cheap enough that we'll incorporate it too.
That was gonna be my question. I feel like one of the barriers that we hear from parents, I don't think it'll reach. One of the barriers that
Nice
we,
try.
I got a big mouth, people can hear me. We hear parents say they're always concerned about the wires. I pulled this wire, I'm worried about these wires, and I do realize that wireless monitoring is expensive, but it's kind of hard to say, well, it's expensive, so your baby's brain's gonna not be as nicely developed because we don't have the money to buy
Yes,
this.
Don't say that.
Yeah, we won't say that, but you do get the point.
Yeah.
If we take, it's about stripping barriers so that nurses and or parents want to do this. You mentioned on one of your slides the hassle of getting the baby out. Wireless, lot less hassle. Parent holding the baby, lot less hassle. Papoosing, lot less hassle. I do think that maybe that wouldn't work for every baby, but it might be a good option for certain rooms to be wireless, and you put the babies in there that you have the more timid parents that don't want to worry about wire. I mean, whatever we have to work out, I think it's an option.
I agree.
There is one kind of wire where you just, it's not three, it's just one. Have you seen
Yeah,
that?
I've seen it. They have it, it's a little, almost like a triangle that goes on baby, and then I saw it at a conference. It must have been at A1. So it's just like a little sticky triangle thing, and it picks up the heart rate, the respiratory rate, and the saturation. I don't remember what company had it out. Do you remember when we were at A1?
I haven't seen it.
So yeah, you're right. The technology is absolutely out there. We need to go to the companies, find out how much they are. I mean, we have options for fundraising sometimes through the Med Foundation. If we have specific needs, that's how we need to present things. We have to have specific needs, the name of the company, the item that we want, the cost that we want. So there's going to be some work on our end before we can ask for that. But that's definitely something that we can put in our need list. And then we have things like the Symmetra Tour, we have Sunburst, we have opportunities for funds, but we have to have a specific thing that we're looking for. So that would be something that would be absolutely ideal to ask for that. Would go along with our couplet care, great, would go along with encouraging the parents for all the reasons that Bob stated in his presentation and you've mentioned. So I would think that that is something that they would be very willing to at least discuss with us. So we just have to do a little bit of work on our end before we can present that. So I'll start looking, see what's out there.
So, I have a question here.
Hang on just a minute. Let me add one more thought to that. The parents adjusting oxygen concentrations is a short-term thing too, because the technology eventually is going to come out that's going to be servo-controlled. So it'll be hooked up to the oximeter, and you could program it so that the ventilator oxygen is automatically adjusted based on the oximeter. They've actually been testing it for like 15 years now. So one of these days that'll be available too.
We discussed metrics, and we've used the tasks to try to give us an idea of parent involvement. How do you suggest that we use metrics to capture that time that parents are spending, or the nurturing piece of this versus the tasks that we've been?
So the pieces of parental interaction that we would like to capture are skin-to-skin time, and then to some extent how that time is spent. How much time is the baby being talked or read or sung to? Are they getting this auditory, not just the contact, but additional input, sensory input, auditory being a significant piece of that? And if we see that isn't happening much, either generally or with a particular kid, then we can focus on that. We can say we need to do more encouraging about reading to babies. How can we get families to spend more time reading to their babies? But we don't really know even how much that's happening right now. I think we know it's not happening enough, but if we can start tracking it, then we can say, we think ideally this might be an hour and a half a day for a baby, and teach families that, and then ask them to monitor it. And in doing so, I think if they're being asked to record it, they'll be more attentive to making it happen. Not all of them, and some of them will feel like it's a burden, but if it's what's important to their baby, I'm willing to put a burden on them to make that happen.
Yeah, because one of the things that we as a group we're talking about is that sometimes it's hard to monitor what is going on in the room when we're not there, and then the barrier of the parents wanting to document, which we've discussed before. If we're going to do this, I'd like it to be accurate. I'd like us to have a really good picture, and I want to make sure that like I said, we're capturing what's really happening. Do you have any suggestions on how we encourage or get the families to document a little bit of what this is going on? I know when Sarah was doing the kangaroo care, some of the families were not interested in recording.
Okay, so I know there will be times when families won't want to do this, and that's just something we have to live with. I don't think that means we don't do it because some families don't want to, because a lot of families will. And I always remember back to PEDS, and this was years ago, but you were still there years ago.
I'm not quite as old as you.
Yet. Where I was a little surprised and pleased to hear that in PEDS, the parents were told, we expect you to be here with your baby and caring for your baby. That's not easy for some parents to hear or do, but do you still do that? So I don't think this is anything different. This is what's best for your baby. We expect you, and maybe expect is too strong a word, but we encourage you to do this and to help us document so that we can do better and so that we can understand what babies are getting and talk about it like medicine. This is like medicine for your baby. This is what your baby's brain needs to grow. And just like we document how much food we give them and how much oxygen we give them, we should document how much sensory input we give them. And my guess is 80% of parents will be fine with that and will do it. And the other 20% who prefer not to do that documentation, we can talk about, we can either ignore that or we can ask the nurses to give it their best guess. I'm not too worried about being 100% precise. If our method of collecting the data is similar from one period to the next, we can still compare those numbers.
I think we had discussed at one previous meeting that once babies go in open cribs and parents love to dress them, etc., we see skin to skin going way down. Not necessarily holding, though. Do we encourage more skin to skin at that point, or just support the parents that want to hold, sing, and do it because they are holding? Is there really a difference between the skin to skin versus just holding at that point in time?
Yeah, so I don't know of any strong data in that regard, but let me give you a couple of guesses. The first is with respect to the probiotic organisms. That's important for babies to get early on. I don't think it's very important later, and particularly in babies who are already out in a crib, whether it's because they weren't very premature or because they were and now they're well along. I think their intestinal flora and their skin flora is pretty well established, and they're not at high risk for sepsis anymore. So the probiotic component of the value of skin to skin, I think, is much, much less. Maybe not zero, but it's I'm going to say it's negligible. The other pieces, one of the things that's important about skin to skin, if you're a 24-weeker, is that's how you stay warm. And that's not important, obviously, for a crib kid. So maybe the only thing they really miss out on is maybe they don't hear the maternal heartbeat as well, and I don't know that that's very important if moms are doing the other things, talking and singing and so forth. So no, I think whatever moms are comfortable with, or dads, is fine.
So with the metrics we're going to be putting together then for the families, do you want that separated out, like the families that are doing skin to skin for the metrics, let's say from birth until open crib, and then open crib after? I mean, do you want to capture?
Are you asking, should skin to skin be separate from?
Yes. Do we want to capture that,
Sure.
or does it matter?
I think that's easy to do, so I'd be curious.
Go ahead and separate that out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you. This has been great to have this conversation, and let's do this a lot more. Not the talk part, but talking about these specific questions about how we get from here to there. I think we'll have to do a lot of that. Just like using the QI example, we've been doing it for many years, and we still aren't where we want to be. We just keep plugging and keep looking at the numbers and keep celebrating when we do well, which is a lot of the time. I expect to have lots of celebration along the way here, and it is something that people come from elsewhere, and people come to Gravens to hear about our experience. It is something that doesn't just benefit our babies, it benefits babies all over, because we are leading the way in a lot of this. So thank you.
Thank you.